Hi guys, it's your Island Girl, and I'm back with another one for you today. And today I'm reacting to Margaret Thatcher, and this one is Britain's greatest prime minister, or its worst. All right, so we're going to get right into this. The link for this will be in the description below if you want to watch it on this term. So come on in, right back, bring your coffee, bring your tea, whatever you're drinking, come on in and learn something with me today. For those who know about her, let me know your thoughts. What do you think about her in the comment section below? So all two of my regular schmecklers, day one, city pie, city poos, come on in, right back. Let's get into this video. Here we go, right about now.
She's one of the longest-serving prime ministers in British history. As head of the Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher led the UK from May 1979 right the way through to November of 1990. In that time, she ushered in an era of reform unparalleled in the 20th century. Under her watch, the post-war settlement was torn up, state assets were privatized, the financial market let rip, and the cultural fabric of Britain changed beyond recognition. But the transformations didn't just stop at home. Alongside her US counterpart Ronald Reagan, Thatcher helped spread the gospel of economic liberty and individual freedom across the entire planet. When she finally left office, she was widely recognized as the most significant British leader since Churchill. Yet while Churchill is still widely loved in the UK, Margaret Thatcher's legacy is hugely divisive. Taking over an ailing Britain, her economic shock therapy devastated entire regions, even as it saved the country as a whole, both worshipped and reviled at home. This is the story of Britain's most controversial leader.
Okay. Most controversial? Okay, a man's world.
When Margaret Hilda Roberts was born on October 13th, 1925, there was nothing that suggested she would one day lead her nation. Her father was a grocer, and young Margaret grew up in achingly modest circumstances. The family had no indoor toilet, and warm water was an unknown luxury. Yet it wasn't a petit bourgeois lifestyle alone that made Margaret an unlikely candidate for future PM. It was the fact that she was a she. Right up until Thatcher became Education Secretary in 1969, there had only ever been 4 female cabinet ministers in UK history and not a single prime minister. As Thatcher herself would say in a TV interview in 1973, the idea of a woman ever rising beyond the cabinet to become prime minister seemed impossible. Still, despite living in a society that considered casual sexism a legitimate hobby, Margaret never really felt she needed to pursue ladylike interests. Her major passion was chemistry, which she studied at Oxford under the Nobel Prize winner Dorothy Hodgkin. But even as she was winning plaudits for her science work, Thatcher was discovering her other lifelong love: politics. In 1945, the UK's first post-war election resulted in a shock win, not for Winston Churchill's Conservatives, but for the left-wing Labour Party of Clement Attlee. The Labour landslide completely upended Britain. In his 6 years in power, Attlee created the NHS, the welfare state, and what became known as the post-war settlements, an unspoken agreement between the parties that the state needed to interfere in the economy. Naturally, Thatcher hated this. 1 year after Attlee took power, she became president of the Oxford University Conservative Association, from where she railed against the Labour tide transforming Britain. So good was she at this that it soon convinced her to enter politics proper. At the 1950 election, Thatcher stood as a Conservative candidate for the seat of Dartford. While some in her party were appalled at the idea of a lady human running, she still managed to increase her share of the local vote by 50%, an early sign of her electoral prowess. But it wasn't enough to win, nor did she net enough votes in the 1951 election, despite this being the election that saw Churchill and the Conservatives return to power. Yet, all was not lost. It was through her campaigning in Dartford that Margaret met Denis Thatcher. A rich, somewhat dopey guy, Denis would turn out to be the ideal husband. He was tremendously supportive of Margaret's ambitions for public office, and so hands-off, it was like he was permanently wearing a straitjacket. Although this did have some odd side effects, such as when Denis went to the cricket rather than interfere in the birth of their children, he was the solid, supportive rock that Margaret needed, especially now that her interest in politics was becoming an obsession. In 1959, after a few years practicing as a barrister, Thatcher stood again for election, this time in the Conservative safe seat of Finchley. Unsurprisingly, she won. More surprisingly, she soon began to skyrocket up through the party's ranks. By 1961, she'd been appointed Secretary in the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance. Although her party lost power in 1964, its new leader, Ted Heath, invited her into the shadow cabinet. Sadly, not the Tory version of the Council of Doom, but what us Brits call the out-of-power party's highest-ranking members. That meant that when Heath unexpectedly won the 1970 election, Margaret Thatcher became only the 5th female cabinet minister in British British history. Despite working for a party full of men who'd never quite mentally removed the "No Girls Allowed" sign from their tree houses, Thatcher had ascended to one of the top positions in the land. Little could anyone have known that this was only the start.
From a humble beginning to where she was, remember her love was chemistry, and then she looked into politics. She on the conservative side, but she was also against the NHS. So interestingly, she climbed the ranks, just keep shooting up into position. Even it was a boys' game or a man's world, she entered into it. Not only that, her husband was very supportive, as he said. He was fond of her. I think he was fond of her ideals and so forth. So he backed her. That's how he ended up. But it's funny. He said, okay, when she was having baby, he was at a crate match. I know they gotta throw some of that in there, but so far it seems as if she has an agenda and she's going to make that come true. So let's continue on here. What else happened? The Iron Lady.
For anyone living in Britain, the 1970s were like being on the world's worst roller coaster. It was a decade when Britain teetered on the verge of bankruptcy, when powerful unions called strikes that paralysed the country. But for Margaret Thatcher, it was also the decade when everyone associated her primarily with milk. In 1971, looking to make savings in the education budget, Thatcher eliminated a post-war policy of free school milk for children. Although it was justifiable, the optics were so bad that it became a PR disaster. For the rest of her tenure, Thatcher was followed everywhere by cries of "Thatcher, milk snatcher." But unpleasant as this was, it was nothing compared to what was going on behind the scenes. Thatcher and Ted Heath hated one another. While it was partly personal, it was also Thatcher being sick of defending her government's dreadful record. It was under Heath that the 3-day week came in, when businesses were only allowed electricity 3 days a week to conserve energy. As a result, the Conservatives lost both 1974 elections. Suddenly, Thatcher was out of government, but now the grocer's daughter from Lincolnshire knew what she had to do. She had to get rid of Heath. These days, losing an election means stepping down as leader of your party, but back then, you could keep right on trucking so long as no one challenged you to a leadership contest. The Conservatives being the party of loyalty, no one wanted to challenge Heath. Except for Thatcher. The newspapers thought she was out of her mind. When Thatcher stood for leader of the Tories, it was assumed that Heath would romp home to victory. But Thatcher went on the attack. Gathering the party's right wing around her, she lambasted Heath's dreadful record. In February 1975, the shock results of the first ballot came in. Thatcher had won. Now, under the Conservative Party's weird rules, this didn't actually make her the leader, but Heath could see his position was untenable, and he stepped aside. And just like that, Thatcher became the first female leader of a major UK party. Not that anyone expected her to rise any further. In 1975, the Labour government was headed by the affable, broadly popular Harold Wilson. So what if Thatcher was making barnstorming anti-communist speeches that earned her the nickname the Iron Lady? So what if the Tories were getting better at messaging? With Wilson leading the Labour Party, she was probably doomed. Unfortunately for Labour, Wilson wouldn't be around much longer. In 1976, Harold Wilson abruptly resigned as Prime Minister, a move now thought to have been brought on by the discovery that he had early-stage Alzheimer's. His replacement was a charisma void known as James Callaghan, a guy so inept that he turned a mildly pro-Labour country into rabid Tories. Under Callaghan, Britain collapsed into economic turmoil. There were gigantic pay freezes, nationwide battles with overpowered unions. In late 1978, things culminated in the Winter of Discontent, a period when uncollected refuse piled high in the streets and bodies were left unburied. It was likely the country's post-war low point. The UK was an ungovernable mess. It was also exactly what Thatcher needed. On March the 28th, Margaret Thatcher called a no-confidence vote in Callaghan's government, triggering an early election. As the campaign heated up, the Conservatives played a blinder, plastering London with posters of long dole queues under the caption, "Labour isn't working." Callaghan, meanwhile, gave the impression of someone who expected to win because, well, duh, his opponent was a girl. On May the 3rd, 1979, the Conservatives won the election by a decent margin. It wasn't a landslide, but it was definitely enough to comfortably form a government. On that date, Margaret Thatcher became not only the UK's first female Prime Minister, but the first female leader of any major Western democracy. As she entered 10 Downing Street, the triumphant Thatcher declared,
"Where there is discord, may we bring harmony."
As you're about to see, this wouldn't exactly happen.
It's crazy that how most of the times when people use difficult situation to gain something from it, or to get to where they want to be. But then again, when you stop to think about it, because she's a female, back then it's like it's not a female race, it's not a female area. So guess what? They underestimated their opponent, and majority of the time that's how a lot of people tend to rise up or to be on top, because guess what? She was climbing ranks. She knew what she was doing. She knew what she needed to get to where she needed to go. But like I said, she was looked at like, oh, she's no threat, because what? It's a female in a male's dominated area. And look at that. Just like that, she became the first female prime minister and the first one to the Western. It's crazy. The first female to be in such a prestige or such a powerful position. I wonder what went through her mind when she realized that she won. I would really. I wonder what went through her opponent's mind when she won. If maybe if I could do it all over again, I wouldn't underestimate her. Jeez, let's continue.
As 1982 dawns, it looked like Britain's first female PM was doomed to be a one-term wonder. In her first years in power, Thatcher had set out her governing style: antagonistic, determined, destructive. In a weird way, she was like a 2010s tech mogul, someone who disrupted, who broke stuff, who assembled something from the wreckage of the old. During her later terms, the economic gains from this destruction would be enough to keep Middle England on side. But as her first term swept by, those gains had yet to materialize. All anyone could see was the destruction. More businesses were failing than at any time since the Great Depression. Unemployment was at record-breaking highs. Privatization of state assets had so far cost tens of thousands of jobs, but not yet brought visible benefits. Despite a famous declaration in October of 1980 that the ladies not for turning, Thatcher's closest advisors were secretly urging her to make a gigantic U-turn lest the Tories be stomped at the 1983 election. And it was onto this sinking ship that Argentina suddenly threw a gigantic lifesaver. And okay, let's just have a quick geography lesson now. Down in the South Atlantic, about 483 kilometers off the Argentine coast, lies the Falkland Islands. Despite being nearly 13,000 kilometers from London, they've been a British territory since at least 1833. By 1982, though, the Falklands were only home to a declining population of 1,800 people. Although Britain still claimed the territory, it refused to invest there, and the private hope of successive governments had been that the islanders would voluntarily accept Argentinian sovereignty at some point in the future. But the military junta in Buenos Aires was tired of waiting. On April 2nd, 1982, they occupied the Falklands. A few days later, they also took the British territory of South Georgia. The junta assumed London was too broke, too unwilling to send soldiers to die for the sake of a godforsaken rock on the other side of the world. They were nearly right. When news broke, the cabinet's feeling was that the Falklands would have to be surrendered. But the junta hadn't counted on Thatcher. Egged on by the Navy, Thatcher declared war on Argentina. A Royal Navy flotilla was sent to retake the islands. With that, the Falklands War began. Today, it's almost impossible to overstate the effect the short war had on Thatcher's popularity. Remember how George W. Bush's approval rating hit 92% after 9/11? Well, something similar happened here. Thatcher's resolute defense of British territory struck a chord with ordinary citizens. It helped that the war was short, lasting a mere 74 days before Argentina surrendered, and that it was very one-sided. 649 Argentine troops were killed versus 255 British troops. But make no mistake, the iron will Thatcher displayed in the face of foreign aggression made her a hero. It elevated her profile on the international stage. Already allied with US President Ronald Reagan, she now started to look like his equal. Come the 1983 election, Thatcher crushed Labour. in a landslide. With her powerful new mandate, the gloves were at last off. Over the next 2 terms, Margaret Thatcher was going to change Britain beyond all recognition.
How crazy is that? Because I did a video on the Falklands War. Now I realize how it came into play, because I watched it, but I didn't see it. I didn't really look at the backstory of it. So now this just enlightened me more to understand it. So because of the war and people saw that she has balls of steel, as some would put it, she got into the 90% rate by regular people to say, okay, she's not that she's just a female, but she's stern and she's rigid, and she'll go and she'll defend us as a country. So guess what? We're going to put her in for another. But yet the country was on a downslope while she was in her term. It wasn't going anywhere. It was just deteriorating. And then all of a sudden, because of this Falkland War, she was on top again. That is crazy.
Thatcher's second term began with a powerful message, appointing Ian McGregor head of the National Coal Board. Back in 1979, Thatcher had hired McGregor to make the state-owned British Steel profitable again. McGregor had achieved this at the loss of 95,000 jobs and at the economic devastation of entire towns. Now Thatcher was asking him to do the same thing for the ailing coal industry. But while British Steel had folded to McGregor's iron will, coal was going to be much tougher. The National Union of Miners was Britain's most powerful union at a time when unions could break an entire premiership. It was the NUM in 1973 that had exacerbated the 3-day week, leading to Ted Heath's downfall. Now they were looking to do the same to Thatcher. Unfortunately for the NUM, Thatcher had brought to this figurative knife fight not just a gun, but a goddamn bazooka. On March 6, 1984, a local strike at Cortonwood Colliery was used by NUM President Arthur Scargill to force a general strike across the nation. But Thatcher was prepared. Coal had been secretly stockpiled. Non-unionized firms were hired to do strike breaking. Police forces were primed to fight. The battle was on. And it really was a battle, or rather a series of battles. The worst took place at Orgreave, when a mounted police charge into a crowd of strikers led to 123 serious injuries. But the main weapon Thatcher deployed wasn't truncheons, but time. As the strike dragged on, laws were passed that stopped the families of striking miners from receiving welfare. In effect, Thatcher starved her enemies into submission. And submit they did.
What?
On March 3, 1985, the strike was called off. The miners returned to work. Broken. Over the next decade, McGregor and his successors closed all but 15 of Britain's 174 deep pits. The economic engine of entire regions was wiped out, leaving jobless wastelands. With NUM defeated, the days of big unions bringing Britain to a standstill were over. But although Thatcher won this war just as she had the Falklands, the other great war of her premiership would prove to be unwinnable. The Troubles were an undeclared civil war in Northern Ireland that pitted majority Protestant Unionists who wanted to stay in the UK against majority Catholic Republicans who wanted to join Ireland proper. When Thatcher took power, the Troubles had already been running for a decade, but they were about to get much worse. Things really kicked off on August 27, 1979, when the IRA first assassinated a member of the royal family, Lord Mountbatten, before killing 18 British soldiers in a double bomb attack. But Thatcher's biggest test came in March of 1981. That month, IRA prisoners, including Member of Parliament Bobby Sands, began a hunger strike to force the British state to treat them as prisoners of war. The thought horrified Thatcher, who declared the men were common criminals, saying, "Crime is crime is crime. It is not political." By the time October rolled around, 10 of the hunger strikers were dead, and their mistreatment had turned them into international celebrities. It had also turned Thatcher into a Republican hate figure. On the 12th of October 1984, an IRA bomb at the Conservative conference in Brighton killed 5 people. Thatcher escaped unharmed and made a speech the following day, vowing to fight on. She hoped to inflict a decisive victory on the forces of republicanism. Instead, the Troubles went supernova. Over the next few years, the IRA bombed civilians, killed policemen with mortars, and even assassinated Thatcher's friend, the Conservative MP Ian Gow. It wouldn't be until Thatcher left office that the Troubles would come to an end, thanks to the work of her successors, John Major and Tony Blair. Although it was
Jeez. And with all of that going on, she's pressing forward. I'm like, golly, she was serious. Like I said, The Iron Lady, indeed, she was just rigid in her ways, and it's like there's no deviation. It's like it's my way or no way at all. I understand you can't just give in to whatever people come with, but you have to hold your ground to an extent. And then because of all of that taking place, she became hated, and it seems as if that didn't bother her one bit. She was thick.
Far from a defining theme of her premiership, Thatcher's failed attempt to defeat the IRA showed the limits of the Iron Lady's power. Sometimes, just sometimes, perhaps the lady should have been for turning.
Jeez. The Big Bang and beyond.
Away from the wars and anti-union crusades, Maggie was also overseeing a social revolution. Thatcherism preached hard work, personal responsibility, and economic liberalism. It promised a world in which anyone could become well off, provided they were happy to roll up their sleeves. While this may have seemed a joke to those in depressed former mining towns, it was true for enough people to keep her in power. One of the most popular policies was right to buy, which allowed those in council housing to save up and buy the place for themselves. But the biggest rewards fell to those who profited from the Big Bang. As early as 1979, Thatcher had begun loosening regulations in London's financial sector, leading to a lot of people becoming very rich. But it was on October the 27th, 1986, that things really took off. That was the day the city was almost completely deregulated, allowing things like foreign firms to own UK brokers and abolishing the fixed commission on trades. Overnight, the Big Bang made 1,500 millionaires. It created iconic districts like London's Canary Wharf. Skyscrapers began to sprout up. Money poured in. It was the transformation of the financial sector from the bowler hat-wearing old boys club of yesteryear into the turbo-capitalist free-for-all of today. Yet Thatcher's revolution went beyond the mere confines of Britain. Under her watch, the UK became a global player in a way it simply hadn't been since Churchill left office. In 1984, for example, Thatcher began courting Mikhail Gorbachev even before he became Soviet leader. During a visit to Britain, Gorbachev famously had a 6-hour argument with Thatcher over the benefits and ills of communism. When they were done, Thatcher declared, "We can do business together," and set about becoming both Gorbachev's best friend and worst enemy in the West, urging a skeptical Ronald Reagan to work with the new Soviet premier. Not that she'd let Russia push her around, though. Invited to the Soviet Union in 1987, Thatcher went on live TV and spent an hour talking about all the USSR's failings. For citizens in communist nations, that speech was like seeing someone articulate everything they'd been feeling for decades. Thatcher became an overnight celebrity in the Eastern Bloc. Even today, countries like the Czech Republic consider her a British hero on par with Churchill. But there were missteps too. In the latter part of the 1980s, Thatcher vehemently opposed sanctions against South Africa's apartheid regime. She considered Nelson Mandela a typical terrorist and proudly boasted that Britain was the only Commonwealth nation still trading with the white supremacist state. Ouch.
What?
Yet there were also surprise moments when she broke her own party's line. In the late 1980s, she became one of the first world leaders to sound the alarm on climate change, helping push for a World Environment Fund, the preservation of rainforests, and the introduction of emissions targets. Overall, then, there was enough popular stuff in the Thatcher programme to ensure that she cruised to an easy victory in 1987, becoming the UK's only 20th century leader to serve 3 terms. And still, she seemed destined to go on. There was even talk of her winning a possible 4th term, but it was not to be. The woman who had overhauled Britain had already sown the seeds of her own destruction. When the end finally came, it was going to be with a swiftness that shocked everybody.
Okay now.
In the end, what brought Thatcher down was what has brought down every single Conservative Prime Minister since: Europe. On January the 1st, 1973, Ted Heath had taken Britain into what was then the European Economic Community, a move confirmed by a 1975 referendum. Come the 1980s, the Conservatives were still mostly a pro-Europe party, at least in theory. Unlike her MPs, Thatcher was rabidly anti-Europe. At first, this was something her MPs managed as best they could. It even occasionally brought benefits when Thatcher reduced Britain's budget contributions in 1984, but it soon became a major liability. As the continent integrated further, Thatcher became a vocal Eurosceptic, rallying against the continent's leaders. This would be fine if she'd managed to get her party on side, but official policy remained pro-Europe. In effect, Thatcher was sabotaging her own government. The result was a string of senior ministers resigning, all contributing to a perception that the Tories were becoming dangerously incompetent. Then, just as this gigantic pile of fertilizer was starting to look extremely combustible, Thatcher threw an unrelated match onto it. The poll tax is why Scotland is to this day passionately anti-Tory. A political move designed to deprive Labour councils of revenue, it abolished local tax rates, instead levying a flat tax on every adult. The upshot was that the rich saw their bills plummet, while the middle classes, the very backbone of the Thatcherite revolution, saw their costs go shooting up. In 1989, Thatcher piloted it in Scotland ahead of a rollout across England and Wales. It was a disaster. There were protests, mass acts of civil disobedience. By 1990, over 1 million had refused to pay. Ministers begged Thatcher not to push ahead with the hated tax. But like a latter-day George III, Thatcher insisted on it. On March...
Here we go again. Like I said, she had her rise when she opened up the market. So, so many people became millionaires at that time. I'm like, okay, now that's what I'm talking about. But then, here boils down to this when it come on to taxes. You see? She put her thumb, stick her thumb in her mouth and can't take it out. Like I said, she have this one trap mind. If she have something to go, it's like, okay, I'm holding on to it and I'm not letting go, and I'm following through. It's like she don't know how to deviate, even if it come at the cost of hurting her. Just listening to him this whole time, I'm like, it's like she can't veer off. She's going to do something, she followed through with it and she don't deviate whatsoever. And that to me was one of her downfall. Like, it's like she can't see nothing else more than what she have planned.
March 31st, 1990, central London was devastated by an anti-poll tax riot. That summer, discontent brewed across the nation. Sadly, by now, Maggie had become a caricature of herself. She was the Iron Lady not for turning, even when turning would have saved her political career.
Exactly.
Things finally came to a head in October. Following a European summit on integration, Thatcher gave an angry speech in which she replied to the idea with a shouted,
No, no, no.
In response, the pro-Europe cabinet member Geoffrey Howe resigned. For such a measured man, his resignation speech was devastating, concluding that the party needed to question its loyalty to Thatcher. At another time, Thatcher could have shrugged it off. But in 1990, with poll tax riots burning across the country and a pro-European party fed up with their Euroscepticism, she was toast. On November the 15th, the Europhile conservative Michael Hestenstein did what Thatcher had herself done to Heath all those years ago. He challenged her to a leadership contest, and when the results came in, Thatcher was doomed. Although she got the most votes, it had been by a pitiable margin. As the two headed into the second round, Thatcher realised to her profound shock that she might lose. So she jumped before she was pushed. At 7:30 a.m. on November the 22nd, 1990, Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister. At the moment she stepped down, she was the longest continuously serving Prime Minister since 1827. She was also one of the two most influential post-war PMs, setting an economic agenda that has pretty much lasted intact until today. Only Clement Attlee really comes close in terms of significance, and it was his long-lasting post-war settlement that Thatcher ripped up. Yet, despite her continued significance, despite her achievement opening the door to future female leaders, Thatcher spent her years out of office bitter and unhappy. She fumed over her betrayal by her party, fumed over the creation of the EU. With nowhere left to channel her prodigious energies, she turned inwards. By 2000, she was showing signs of the dementia that would soon consume her, just as Alzheimer's had consumed Harold Wilson before her. By the end, the dementia rendered her mute, almost incapable of doing even the simplest action. It said she'd like to spend her days staring at a painting of a Victorian hunting party, not really doing anything, just watching the crowd of painted dogs for signs of life. Margaret Thatcher passed away on April the 8th, 2013. While the world mourned the death of a great leader, the reaction in Britain itself, where towns devastated by her economic policies still haven't recovered, was more mixed. That week, the number 2 record in the British chart was Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Yet, for all the bile many heaped upon her, for all the hatred she stirred up, Thatcher's legacy is all around us. It's from her Euroscepticism that the forces grew that would unleash Brexit, from her wave of deregulation that today's City of London was created. Almost every facet of modern life that we Brits take for granted, the depressed post-industrial towns, the special relationship with America, the lack of paralyzing French-style strikes, all have their roots in Thatcherism. In the end, then, the good and the bad of her legacy are impossible to separate. She was who she was, with the blind faith to do both necessary things for Britain's future and to commit screw-ups that still haunt the nation to this day. In a world without Maggie Thatcher, many would be worse off, some would be better off, but all would be able to agree on one thing. They were living in a completely different world from us, one in which Britain, Europe, and the former nations of the Soviet Union had very different fates. If greatness is measured purely in terms of impact, then that surely makes her one of the greatest prime ministers of all. So,
Okay, I see where he's going with what he said. Based on everything that he said, what makes her one of the greatest prime ministers of all time. And I can't even believe that she served that long. One of the longest. That is just amazing to know. But like he said, blinded faith. She had her sight on something and she would not deviate from it. That's one of the things I've noticed throughout the whole video. It's like whenever time she channels something, she's like, okay, we're dealing with taxes, poll tax. This is what we're dealing with. She won't deviate, even if it's gonna hurt her. And I see why they called her the Iron Lady. She was stern, she was strict, but it's sad how that after everything that she had accomplished, at the end of the day, she ended up being with dementia, and she ended up being bitter. Come on, you accomplished so much, you've done so much. The party go against it because you wouldn't listen. You couldn't see the wrong that you were doing or the wrong path you were taking. She couldn't. And then again, I remember doing a video and she came up and they were saying she wasn't the one that's steering the ship. It was her husband that was calling the shots behind her. I don't know. That was one thing that was a couple people said in the comment section. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Do you think she was one of the greatest, or do you think that she was the worst? But when, like I said, when I listened to it, there was good and bad, and with everybody, there's nobody that is perfect. And in times when you stop to look at persons that are prime minister, they're only but human. They do what they think is right, and they do, and there's nothing you can tell them otherwise. It's like a hit and go. There's no manual into running a country. But if you see a people is balling, or you see that it's not the best for the people, why not change? Why be so hard and stick to you got to say, listen, this is what I want and this is what's going to happen. But I really learned a lot from this one. Was she the greatest of all time? I have to look at others before I can agree with what he said. But she'd done a lot of good and she'd done a lot of bad. And like I said, the future or the present is what it is based on the decisions that she made, both good and bad. It helped, it built, it left a lasting effect. So it's the Island Girl, and I'm running out of here. Let me know, like I said, your thoughts in the comment section. Let me know what you'd like me to check out next, because it will be done. The sun is coming in today, guys. It's not raining. Love you guys. Be good. Be kind. Love each other. Be safe. That's it from me. See you guys in another one. Bye.